It began not with a confrontation, but with a file. A quiet, unassuming stack of internal palace documents placed before King Charles, marked with annotations that should never have existed. What he read in those pages did not merely raise concern, it ignited something far deeper. Because hidden between routine reports and operational notes was a pattern. And that pattern pointed unmistakably to one person, Camilla. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, Charles approached the documents with the calm detachment of a monarch accustomed to bureaucracy, expecting nothing more than procedural updates flagged by overcautious aides. But as his eyes moved from one page to the next, that calm began to fracture. There were notes subtle, almost invisible at first glance, referencing decisions that had bypassed traditional channels. Advisory roles had shifted quietly, without formal announcements. Staff who once reported directly to long-established offices were now appearing under new chains of command, their loyalties redirected in ways that were never openly declared. And threaded through it all, like a whisper that refused to be silenced, was Camilla's name, not boldly stated, but implied, suggested, embedded in the margins where influence often hides best. The deeper Charles read, the more the inconsistencies began to align into something far more deliberate. Financial approvals, once predictable and transparent, were now being routed through channels that bore an unmistakable pattern of alignment. Not overt enough to raise immediate alarm, but consistent enough to suggest intention. It was not chaos, it was design. That realization lingered heavily, pressing against the weight of disbelief that Charles initially clung to. Because this was not how the system was supposed to function. Not under his reign, not within the carefully balanced structure he believed he understood. Yet the evidence was there, quiet but undeniable, forming a narrative he could no longer ignore. What unsettled him more than the content itself was the timing. These documents had been flagged carefully, deliberately, and yet they had not reached him until now. Palace insiders, those who operated in the shadows of official protocol, had already begun to murmur about delays, about hesitation, about a growing awareness that something within the palace walls was shifting, and not everyone was willing to confront it. That hesitation now took on a new meaning as Charles sat with the realization that this review had not just been postponed, it had been held back. And the question that followed was far more dangerous than the documents themselves. Who had the power to delay information from the king? The silence in that moment was not empty. It was charged, filled with the quiet echo of decisions made behind closed doors, decisions that were never meant to surface. And as Charles turned the final page, the unease that had begun as a flicker now settled into something far more defined, something heavier, something impossible to dismiss. Because this was no longer about isolated anomalies or administrative oversight. It was about a system that had begun to evolve without his knowledge, guided by a force that operated just beneath the surface, subtle, strategic, and increasingly impossible to ignore, leading him to a realization that would change everything that followed. Because what Charles uncovered in those documents was only the surface, because the deeper he read, the more it became clear this wasn't influence, it was control. At first, it had seemed harmless small adjustments, quiet suggestions, a voice at the table that grew steadily louder. But influence does not arrive with a declaration. It seeps in, slowly, deliberately, and by the time anyone notices, it has already reshaped the room. Camilla's presence within palace operations had evolved beyond expectation, and now even seasoned insiders were beginning to question how far it had truly gone. In those early days, her role had been framed as supportive, almost incidental, a steady presence beside Charles, offering perspective without ever appearing to direct outcomes. That was the narrative. That was what the palace allowed the world, and perhaps even itself, to believe. But beneath that calm exterior, something quieter was unfolding. Conversations that once ended with polite acknowledgement began to carry weight. Suggestions that were once optional began to linger, revisited, reconsidered, eventually adopted. No announcement marked the shift. No formal decree acknowledged it. Yet, slowly, the structure began to bend. Staff appointments, once the domain of established channels, started reflecting subtle preferences that could not easily be traced, but were impossible to ignore. Names surfaced that aligned not with tradition, but with proximity, with trust, with loyalty that extended beyond protocol. And as those individuals stepped into their roles, the atmosphere within the palace began to change in ways that were difficult to define, but increasingly difficult to dismiss. Schedules shifted next. Not dramatically, not in ways that would draw immediate scrutiny, but enough to redirect access, to reshape who was heard and when. Meetings were recalibrated. Voices that once held prominence found themselves waiting, while others newer, quieter, began to move closer to the center of influence. It was not disruption. It was reorganization, carried out with a precision that suggested foresight rather than coincidence. And surrounding it all was an informal network that seemed to grow without ever being formally recognized. Advisors, confidants, figures who operated just outside the official framework, yet whose presence became increasingly felt in the outcomes that followed. Their influence was never declared, yet their alignment was unmistakable. Departments within the palace, once operating with clear independence, began to echo similar patterns, decisions that reflected a shared direction, a unified tone that had not existed before. Some saw it as efficiency, others saw something else entirely. Because within the ranks of senior aides, a quiet division began to form. There were those who accepted the shift, who adapted, who aligned themselves with the new rhythm of power, recognizing where influence now resided. And then there were those who watched with growing unease, sensing that the balance they had long relied upon was beginning to tilt. They did not speak openly. Not at first. But concern has a way of finding its voice, even in the most controlled environments. And as whispers began to circulate, they carried with them a question that no one could fully answer: how far had this already gone? That question took on a sharper edge during moments when Charles himself appeared less present, when the weight of his own health struggles subtly altered the pace of decision-making within the palace. In those periods, the shift did not pause. It accelerated, quietly, efficiently, as though the system had already adapted to function in a new way, one that no longer required constant oversight from the throne. And that realization lingered, heavy and unresolved, because as the timeline unfolded, one unsettling truth began to surface beneath it all: this was never random, never reactive, never accidental, it had been methodical. Power in the palace rarely operates in isolation. It moves through people-trusted voices, silent enforcers, and carefully placed allies. And as Charles examined the documentation more closely, a network began to reveal itself. Names appeared repeatedly. Decisions traced back to the same circle. What once seemed like coincidence now looked like coordination. And at the center of it all, Camilla's quiet authority cast a far longer shadow than anyone had admitted. The pattern was no longer subtle once it was seen. It sharpened with every page, every annotation, every cross-reference that connected one decision to another. Certain individuals surfaced again and again, not always in prominent roles, not always leading from the front, but always present when it mattered most. They were positioned carefully, embedded within key departments, shaping outcomes without drawing attention to themselves. It was not influence in the traditional sense. It was alignment. Deliberate, sustained, and increasingly difficult to separate from the institution itself. As Charles followed the trail, what unsettled him most was not the presence of these figures, but the consistency of their involvement. Critical decisions, staffing, scheduling, financial approvals were no longer dispersed across a broad structure. They converged, quietly, predictably, always touching the same hands before moving forward. Internal memos reflected this with a precision that could not be ignored. The language was controlled, measured, but beneath it ran a clear and unified direction. A strategy that had been executed not through orders, but through repetition, through reinforcement, through a system that no longer needed to be told what to do, because it had already learned. And within that system, staff reshuffles began to take on new meaning. What had once been explained as routine transitions now revealed a deeper pattern, positions opening at precisely the right moments, replacements stepping in with the exact. Alignment required to maintain continuity. It was seamless. Too seamless. Because real change creates friction. It disrupts. This did not. This moved like something that had been planned long before it was ever noticed. Communication patterns only deepened the concern. Messages were routed in ways that bypassed traditional oversight, flowing instead through channels that remained unofficial, yet remarkably effective. Conversations that should have been documented were reduced to fragments, their full context understood only by those within the circle. And yet, despite the growing clarity of what was unfolding, there was a silence that surrounded it, a silence that was not accidental. Concerns had been raised, quietly, carefully, in conversations that never reached the level of formal record. Senior aides had questioned the direction, the consistency, the increasing concentration of influence, but those concerns had stopped short of escalation, as though an unspoken boundary had been drawn, one that no one was willing to cross. That silence spoke louder than any document. It suggested awareness, it suggested hesitation, and more than anything, it suggested that whatever this network had become, it was already powerful enough to deter challenge. Charles could feel that realization settling in, heavy and undeniable, because this was no longer a matter of isolated influence or even coordinated effort. This was something deeper, something embedded, a system that had begun to operate with its own momentum, its own logic, its own quiet authority. And as he traced the final connections, one thought refused to leave him: networks alone do not shift power. But what truly alarmed him was how those networks were beginning to alter the institution itself. The monarchy is built on tradition, on systems that resist change, that outlast individuals. But what Charles now saw unfolding was something different. Policies weren't just being adjusted, they were being redirected. Priorities subtly rewritten, and decisions that once followed centuries of precedent were now bending in new directions. The question was no longer whether Camilla had influence, but whether that influence was reshaping the very structure of royal operations. At first, the changes appeared procedural, almost invisible to anyone not looking closely. Protocols were refined, language in official processes slightly altered, approvals taking new routes that seemed efficient on the surface, but carried deeper implications. Underneath, what had once been a predictable rhythm within palace operations began to feel unfamiliar, as though the institution itself was learning to move differently. And that shift did not happen all at once. It emerged in fragments, in small decisions that accumulated over time until the original framework was no longer fully intact. Charitable focus offered one of the clearest signals. Engagements that had once reflected long-standing commitments quietly pivoted toward new priorities, not abandoned outright, but gradually overshadowed by initiatives that aligned more closely with a different vision. The change was subtle enough to avoid public scrutiny, yet significant enough to alter the direction of influence. Within internal discussions, the reasoning was always sound, strategic, forward-thinking, necessary. But beneath that reasoning lingered a pattern that Charles could no longer dismiss, because it was not just what was changing, but how consistently those changes pointed in the same direction. That consistency began to strain the very people who had dedicated themselves to preserving the monarchy's traditions. Among senior staff, particularly those who had served through multiple reigns, a quiet resistance started to take shape. It was not rebellion, it was hesitation. a reluctance to fully embrace a system that felt increasingly unfamiliar, even as they were expected to operate within it. Their concerns were rarely voiced openly, but they surfaced in subtle ways, in delayed responses, in careful phrasing, in the growing distance between what was expected and what was quietly questioned. And beyond the walls of individual departments, the tension extended further, threading its way through the relationships between royal households themselves. Communication became more guarded, interactions more calculated. What had once functioned as a unified structure now showed signs of fragmentation, with different factions interpreting the direction of change in ways that did not always align. It was not open conflict, but it was unmistakable. A shift in trust, a recalibration of influence, and at the center of it all was a growing realization that decisions were no longer moving freely unless they aligned with the emerging priorities. Approvals slowed, proposals lingered. Initiatives that did not fit the evolving direction found themselves delayed without clear explanation, as though an invisible filter had been placed over the system. For Charles, this was the moment where observation turned into something far more personal. Because these were not abstract changes. They were happening within the institution he believed he understood, under a reign he believed he was guiding. And yet, the deeper he examined the patterns, the more distant that sense of control began to feel. The monarchy was still standing, the structure still intact. But its internal mechanics, its decisions, its priorities, its direction were shifting in ways that no longer fully answered to him. And as that realization settled in, heavier with each passing moment, it forced him to confront a question that could not be ignored, one that cut far deeper than policy or protocol. How had this happened under his watch? For a king, authority is absolute in theory, but in reality, it is deeply complicated. Because what Charles now faced was not a simple administrative issue. It was personal. The woman at the center of these revelations was not an outsider, she was his closest confidante. And every document he reviewed pulled him deeper into a conflict between duty and loyalty, one that no monarch can escape without consequence. The weight of it did not arrive all at once. It settled slowly, pressing against every instinct he had relied on for decades. Because this was not just about systems or structures anymore. It was about trust, about the delicate line between partnership and power. And for the first time since the pattern had begun to reveal itself, Charles found himself questioning not just what had happened, but what it meant. The implications stretched far beyond the pages in front of him, reaching into the very core of the institution he was meant to protect. In private, conversations began to unfold. Carefully chosen voices, individuals whose loyalty had been tested over years, were brought into the circle of awareness. These were not casual discussions. They were measured, deliberate exchanges where every word carried consequence. Some urged caution, reminding him that perception could be as dangerous as reality, that any misstep, any visible fracture could ripple far beyond palace walls. Others were less restrained. They spoke of urgency, of the need to reassert control before the shift became irreversible. Their tone carried an undercurrent of concern that bordered on warning, as though they too could feel the ground beneath them changing. And beneath all of it was a shared understanding that this could not remain contained forever. Because if the truth behind these changes surfaced publicly, it would not be interpreted as quiet evolution. It would be seen as something far more volatile, a question of authority, of influence, of who truly guided the direction of the monarchy. That possibility lingered heavily, shaping every consideration Charles made. He knew how fragile public trust could be, how quickly perception could turn uncertainty into doubt. And doubt, once planted, had a way of growing beyond control. At the same time, pressure from within began to build. Traditionalists, those who had long guarded the stability of the institution, were no longer content with observation. Their expectation was clear, even when unspoken. Action was needed, decisive, unmistakable action that would reaffirm the structure they believed was beginning to weaken. But action, in this context, was not simple. Because any move he made would not exist in isolation. It would echo through relationships, through loyalties, through the fragile balance that held the royal family together. And that was where the deeper fear began to take hold, not of external consequence, but of internal fracture. Because this was not a distant issue, it was embedded within the family itself, intertwined with bonds that could not be easily separated from the roles they carried. To challenge what was unfolding would mean confronting those bonds directly, risking a division that could not be quietly repaired. Yet to remain still, to allow the system to continue on its current path, carried its own danger. A slower one, perhaps, but no less significant. Because inaction, Charles began to understand, was not neutrality, it was permission. Permission for the shift to deepen, for the structure to continue evolving beyond his reach, for the balance of power to settle in a place he had never intended. And as that realization took hold, it became impossible to ignore the truth that had been building beneath every document, every conversation, every moment of hesitation. Because in moments like this, hesitation itself becomes a decision, and what Charles chose next would not just respond to the situation, it would define everything that followed. There was no announcement, no public statement, just a shift, subtle, calculated, almost invisible to the outside world. But inside the palace, it was unmistakable. Meetings were restructured, approvals rerouted. Conversations that once flowed freely were now carefully controlled. Charles had begun to act, not with confrontation, but with precision. And those who understood palace dynamics knew exactly what it meant. This was not a reaction driven by emotion. It was a recalibration, quiet, deliberate, and deeply strategic. The kind of movement that does not announce itself, but makes its presence felt in the spaces where power is actually exercised. Reporting structures were the first to change, not dramatically, but enough to redirect the flow of information back toward the center. Lines that had gradually drifted outward were drawn inward again, reconnecting departments to the authority they were originally meant to serve. It was a subtle correction, yet those within the system felt it immediately. Because when access shifts, so does influence. And when influence shifts, the entire rhythm of decision-making begins to change. Alongside that, personnel adjustments followed, each one measured, each one carrying implications that extended far beyond the individual roles involved. Positions were reassigned, not with explanation, but with purpose. Figures who had quietly risen within the previous structure found themselves repositioned, their proximity to key decisions altered in ways that could not be openly questioned, yet could not be ignored either. At the same time, others' long-standing, trusted voices began to reappear within critical conversations, their presence signaling a return to a more familiar balance. It was not removal. It was replacement of emphasis. A shift in who was heard and when. Oversight from Charles's direct office grew more pronounced as well, though it never crossed into overt control. Instead, it manifested through timing, through the careful review of proposals, through a renewed insistence that decisions follow a path that could be traced clearly back to the throne. Nothing moved unchecked anymore. Every approval carried the weight of awareness, as though the system itself had been reminded that it was being watched again. And perhaps most telling of all was the quiet narrowing of informal advisory channels. Conversations that had once operated outside official structures began to lose their influence, not through confrontation, but through absence. They simply stopped reaching the same level of impact. The pathways they relied on were no longer as accessible, no longer as effective. It was not a shutdown. It was a withdrawal of space, and in that withdrawal their power began to diminish. Those who had once operated within those circles felt it first, a subtle resistance where there had once been openness, a delay where there had once been immediacy. And within that change, a message took shape, unspoken, yet unmistakable. The structure was being reclaimed. Slowly, carefully, without spectacle. Palace insiders did not need confirmation to understand what was happening. They recognized the pattern, the controlled nature of the shift, the way it unfolded without ever drawing attention to itself. This was how authority reasserted itself when it could not afford disruption. This was how balance was restored without exposing the instability that had preceded it. And yet, even as the system began to settle into this new alignment, a deeper uncertainty lingered beneath the surface. Because recalibration, no matter how precise, cannot erase what has already taken root. And as the balance began to shift back toward the center, one question refused to fade: had the change come soon enough? Or had the structure already moved too far to be fully brought back under control? In royal history, the most significant moments are often the quietest. No headlines, no declarations, just a pause, a collective stillness as everyone waits to see what comes next. And now, within the palace walls, that stillness had settled in, because while Charles had begun to respond, the full extent of what had already changed remained uncertain, leaving the entire institution suspended in a fragile, uneasy balance. The tension was no longer hidden. It moved through corridors in silence, settled into conversations that stopped just short of honesty, lingered in the space between what was said and what was understood. Staff who once operated with clarity now found themselves navigating uncertainty, unsure of where influence truly rested or how far the recalibration would reach. Royal households, too, felt the shift, their interactions measured, their alignment no longer assumed but carefully considered. No one spoke openly, yet everyone was watching. Watching who stepped forward, watching who stepped back, watching for signs that would reveal where the future was beginning to take shape. That uncertainty carried weight, because roles that had once felt secure now seemed subject to quiet change, and influence once defined by tradition felt increasingly fluid. At the same time, scrutiny tightened. Internal operations, once shielded by routine, were now observed with a sharper lens, every decision carrying the possibility of deeper meaning. Even beyond the palace, subtle signals began to ripple outward. The media, always sensitive to shifts beneath the surface, started to sense it not through clear revelations, but through tone, through absence, through the slight misalignment of what was expected and what was unfolding. And within the palace itself, allies on all sides held their positions carefully, waiting, calculating, aware that any move made too soon or too late could redefine their place within a structure that no longer felt entirely stable. It was not chaos. It was something far more delicate, a quiet instability, controlled but undeniable, where every action carried consequence and every hesitation allowed the uncertainty to deepen. And in that silence, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was no longer just about influence, it was about legacy. Because in the end, every decision within the monarchy echoes far beyond the present moment. It shapes how history will remember not just a reign, but a legacy. And for King Charles, what began as a simple review of documents had transformed into something far more profound, a reckoning with the future of the institution itself. One that would define not only his leadership, but the balance of power within the royal family for years to come. The question was no longer confined to what had already changed, but what those changes would become over time. Because influence, once established, does not simply disappear, it evolves. It adapts. It leaves traces that shape decisions long after the moment has passed. And within that reality, the responsibility placed upon Charles grew heavier. Not as a figure of authority, but as a guardian of continuity. The monarchy was not just an institution to be managed, it was a legacy to be preserved, one that required careful balance between adaptation and protection. Yet that balance had already been tested. The shifts within internal power had created ripples that could extend into succession, into leadership, into the very way the monarchy would function in the years ahead. And at the center of that uncertainty remained a tension that had never fully resolved. A question that lingered without clear answer: how far had Camilla's influence truly gone? And what part of it could ever be undone? That uncertainty refused to settle, because some changes, once made, become part of the foundation they once challenged. And so the story does not end with clarity or closure, but with something far more powerful: a sense of unresolved direction, where every decision moving forward carries the weight of everything that came before. Because in the monarchy, power is never truly taken, it is either protected or quietly lost. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.